So today, for my final slideshow or my final project or final whatever you'd like to call it, we're going to be discussing witchcraft and the magic inside the Navajo as well as the Azande culture. So the first kind of topic or the first idea that we're going to be discussing is the theory that surrounds religion and how it officially started as a whole. I believe, and the theory believes, in the fact that there was kind of two main reasons as to why religion started. The first being the fact that it helped build a moral compass or an ethical compass or whatever compass in a time that was very primitive, a time that was very violent, a time that was just very overall aggressive and resulted in a lot of death. And it helped kind of build a wrong from right, or what is wrong and what is right, and what helped people kind of face that idea. And this probably would start obviously in a small group of people who believed in it, and it would eventually evolve to what it is today, where it is a large thing, it is a large group of people and a large group of everything that follows it. So the next thing that we're going to be discussing, or the second idea that we're going to be discussing, is the fact that it also helped build a sense of a safety blanket in a time that was very primitive, like discussed before, a time that was very violent, like discussed before, where death was very uncertain. Today we can say, oh, I can live to 30 or something like that, or oh, I can live to this. But back then, you really don't know when your time is going to come. So essentially, we're going to be facing the idea of how that's going to work out. How is that going to be happen, or how is that going to be solved? And what they thought of that to be solved at the time was through religion. And thinking the idea that when you pass, there is a life that is better than what was before if you follow the law of the world and the law of the earth. So essentially, we're going to be discussing, we're going to be looking into some of these entities that were followed through the law of the earth, I like to call it. But we're going to be going on to the next slide. Are going to be looking at the first thing, which is primarily, well, it's in both, but we're going to be looking primarily, firstly, at the Navajo culture, which is there's two good sides to the religious battle. The first being the fact that there was the good with the shamans and the bad with the skinwalkers. Also, I apologize for me completely butchering this, but called the Yi Naaldushi, which sounds very French, but I'm sure that it isn't French. But where basically that means is with it, they all go on fours, or he goes on all fours, which is essentially what a skinwalker is, and this is a spirit or a person who has the ability to possess or essentially live in a predator, because that was their main goal, was to be a predator and cause harm to main people. So we're going to move on to the next slide, and we're going to look at with shamanism and medicine men for the Navajo culture, which these, if you want to look at it from a Star Wars perspective, is the Force to the dark side in skinwalkers. So we're going to be looking at this, and we're going to be looking at how it's kind of discussed with their spiritual beliefs as well as their religious beliefs, and how shamanism can heal an individual from through holy power, and how that is essentially being used to be productive towards providing for a positive result and not a negative result, as seen through the skinwalkers. So when moving on to the next slide, we're going to be looking at how you kind of do that and for the Navajo culture, because it was a popular thing. In a world where jobs were pretty limited, there wasn't much more honorable than being a shaman or being someone who would help people. Maybe not honor. There obviously was honor, but if you want to be a person who could help people, this is certainly what you wanted to do. So similar to many blue-collar jobs or whatever jobs or trades jobs or skills jobs, you would start as an apprentice under someone who was more elder to you in experience, or more experienced overall. This would be an older healer, most likely, because it takes a very long time to do. This would result in the individual or the youngling or the person who was under them, the apprentice, starting with learning singing routines, as well as getting proper materials for rituals or gatherings and assemblings. The one thing that I thought was very interesting about the whole idea of these songs is just how difficult it was. Most experienced shamans or respected shamans would only know right around 2 songs until their passing or until they died. In their whole entire life, they would only be able to perform 2 different songs. So I thought that was a very interesting aspect to this whole idea of shamanism. And if you did 3, you'd be really above average. You'd be very above par. And then the last thing discussing about this is the interesting thing where women can actually be partaking in this as a healer. So I thought that was a very interesting aspect where, time was very limited for opportunities for women that period of time, but you could be someone that could help somebody. And I think it was really awesome. But when moving on to the next slide, we'll look at the Azande of the North Central Africa. So the difference between these 2 people, or these 2 tribes, I should say, is the fact that there wasn't necessarily a shaman for the Azande. For them, they were believing that if something that shouldn't happen, then is at fault of a witch. So I thought that was pretty interesting, and how it gives great pressure to the witch who is trying to help. And as this will be discussed later, it was through an oracle right here to identify the witchcraft as a whole. One thing kind of helped ensure, obviously not ensure, but made me feel a little bit better. And I think that what this kind of describes really primitive things and really out of a normal society, thousands of years from then. The fact that they would use they use reasoning, not just hate or their belief in overall magic. Both when you were sick, you would visit a doctor as well as a witch doctor, which was very interesting for the Azande. But when moving on to the next slide, we're going to be looking at our first oracle, which is the poison oracle, which out of them all is the most powerful. So for this one, unfortunately, only men could be able to use this great power, which is quite unfortunate, but that's just how it was, which I think is, obviously in a historical sense is quite interesting. But for this one, you would be using a chicken, and then if the chicken dies, then the accusation that you are trying to find is true. And it was usually made to find which if a person was ill or not. And also, which I thought was pretty interesting, if adultery had been taking place. So for the slide 6, we're going to move to the types of oracles number 2, which is the termite oracle, which the termite oracle is quite interesting because for this one, men and women could also be partaking in this, children as well. And you can say that it would take a branch from 2 trees or sticks overnight into a termite mound, which you would stick it into the ground, and whichever stick is eaten more gives the answer, which I think is really interesting because we kind of see this as as something you don't really it took me a while to get my head around it, but I think it's really interesting because if you want to put your feet in their shoes at that period of time, and it's really hard to decide on what things to believe in, and using the earth or using the environment around you to help decide your fate or decide a fate is very interesting. And I would say for a time in which had little technology and had little advancement, that is pretty genius. I personally wouldn't think of it. So I think it's really interesting. And then for our last one, we're going to do the rubbing board oracle, which is also men and women can be can partake in. I apologize. So for this, they would leave which is it also is the least expensive and least reliable form of all these oracles. Carries 2 pieces of different pieces of wood, and the second piece sticks first. And if these 2 pieces stick first, then the answered question would be true. So when moving on to the second or the last, third to last slide, we look at Sir Evans Pritchard's, who is an English anthropologist instrumental in developing the social anthropology and studied in the Azande, but also wrote the Witchcraft and Oracles and Magic among the Azande. So very I think for something that was really seen, and we can see this in many of the books we read, how it was very kind of considered very weird or very not really thought upon, especially for when he was in this field where it was really the peak of, or at least the peak start of the Industrial Revolution, where things were very becoming modernized and everybody wanted the modern thing. Everyone wanted the new thing. It was very interesting and very awesome to actually hear that he kind of wanted to take a step back and he wanted to be instrumental in the development of social anthropology. So in moving to the next thing, or slide 9, he basically wrote theories of primitive religion, arguing how against the existing theories that were at the time called primitive religious practices, which I think is really important because people would just consider these things to be made of just the fact that these people who were partaking in these religious activities were just considered not ahead of their time because of the technology that they didn't have, which in reality I think could be considered very far from the truth because time is a great weapon in creating the truth, in the sense that with all this time that they had to partake in these religious events, there has to be some truth in it, and people didn't want to find truth in it. Which unfortunately is very apparent in now and before with how ignorance is made. If there is a simple answer where you don't have to think too much about it, then that might be the answer people want to take. The last thing is people argued to find a way to explain other cultures without introducing the ones with their own thoughts and opinions, which I think is a very, also discussing the old before, how it's very important because limiting bias and limiting personal bias is very important for discussing something that's very controversial at the time. And I mean, I think it still is, unfortunately. I think people agree with it, but I don't think people fully understand it. And I don't think I fully understand it either. It's a very complicated subject, but I think removing any bias and just seeing it for how it was is very important because I think obviously I can't relate to Evans Pritchard in the sense that I never, obviously was there, but when reading the books, it's really hard to read your cultural bias or your societal bias in the fact that you kind of have an idea of what's right and wrong, and reading for the first books at least, where you see, oh wow, they're giving ayahuasca and they're giving drugs to babies and animals and things like that. I think that's you have to get past the changes in society. So I think looking at the last slide, I'm pretty sure this is this works cited slide. This is also used in my essay that you'll read in a little bit, but I just wanted lastly to thank you. Obviously we have 2 more weeks, but this is the final project. This is kind of the final big thing and the first hello that I'm saying to you in person. I just want to thank you for a great semester and really a big learning kind of curve, because I think out of all my classes, this is the one that has been the most out of the ordinary, but in a good way. So thank you very much. Have a great semester and have a great rest of your year.